truck looks finished. Faded paint, sagging suspension, a bed full of scrap, and an engine bay coated in dust thick enough to write your name in. Then the owner turns the key. The starter drags for a second. The whole truck shudders, and the Ford Inline-Six catches. No drama, no tuning laptop, no fresh rebuild. It just settles into a steady idle like it was parked yesterday. So why did this plain, slow work truck engine earn a reputation for refusing to die? The answer was not one miracle part. It was an entire design philosophy. Ford introduced the 300 cubic inch Inline-Six in 1965, and from the beginning, it was not built to win spec sheet arguments. It was a 4.9-liter truck engine designed for people who needed the key to turn, the load to move, and the machine to come back tomorrow. Its home was the working side of Ford's lineup. You found it in F-Series pickups hauling tools, feed, lumber, and trailers. You found it in Econoline vans that spent their lives starting and stopping through delivery routes. You found it in Broncos, in heavier truck applications, and in equipment that never cared what badge was on the grill. That mattered because the engine's real test was not a quarter-mile run. It was a cold morning with a weak battery. It was idling at a job site for hours. It was pulling weight at low speed, running hot, running dusty, and getting serviced by whoever had a wrench in a few minutes. On paper, the numbers looked ordinary. Horsepower was modest, especially compared with Ford's V8s. But owners were not buying it for bragging rights. They valued the low-end torque, the simple layout, the room to reach parts, and the feeling that the engine was never working as hard as the truck around it. That is why the 300 earned its reputation in places where engines are usually used up quietly. Farms, fleets, construction yards, municipal garages, and industrial sites turned it into a tool. Not glamorous, not fast, but useful enough that Ford kept finding reasons to build it for decades. The shape of the 300 was one of its biggest advantages. As an inline-six, all 6 cylinders sat in a single row, stretching the engine out from front to back. That made it long, but it also made the basic layout extremely orderly. 1-cylinder bank, 1-cylinder head, 1 exhaust side, 1 intake side, and fewer parts fighting for space. That straight layout also helped the engine run smoothly, without needing much trickery. In an inline-six, the movement of the pistons naturally balances well, so the engine does not have to rely on complicated balancing hardware to feel steady. For truck work, that mattered at low speeds, where vibration, lugging, and constant load can punish an engine over time. Ford built the 300 around a crankshaft supported by 7 main bearings. That is a key detail. The crankshaft is the long rotating shaft that turns piston movement into usable power, and the main bearings are the supports that hold it in place. With 7 of them, the crank had support between every pair of cylinders and at both ends, spreading load across the length of the engine. That extra support paid off when the engine was pulling hard. Instead of letting the crank flex heavily under torque, the bearing arrangement helped keep it stable. In practical terms, it meant the bottom end of the engine could tolerate low revolutions, heavy throttle, and long hours without acting fragile. The materials matched the same thinking. The block was cast iron. The cylinder head was cast iron. These parts were heavy, and they belonged to an older school of engine design, but they were strong, rigid, and forgiving. They handled heat, pressure, imperfect maintenance, and hard service better than something built mainly to save weight. None of this made the 300 exotic. It did not have an advanced layout or expensive materials. Its strength came from conservative engineering, a simple shape, generous support, thick iron castings, and design choices aimed at survival. That was the hidden value. Owners trusted it because the engine was built like it expected work, not applause. Above that heavy bottom end, the 300 stayed just as straightforward. It used an overhead valve pushrod layout, which meant the camshaft sat down in the block, and long pushrods carried motion up to rocker arms in the cylinder head. Those rocker arms opened and closed the valves. That layout was old school, but it gave the engine a practical advantage. The cylinder head did not need overhead camshafts, extra chains, complicated tensioners, or tightly packed hardware. It was a relatively simple iron head, with valves, springs, rockers, and passages that a mechanic could understand without treating the engine like a puzzle box. For owners, that mattered more than brochure technology. A farmer trying to get a truck running before morning chores did not need an exotic valve train. A fleet mechanic responsible for several work trucks needed parts that were available, procedures that were familiar, and repairs that could be done with normal tools. The 300 fit that world. Valve adjustments, gasket work, ignition repairs, and top-end service were all helped by the engine's plain layout and generous access. It was not that nothing ever failed. It was that when something did need attention, the engine usually gave the person working on it a fair chance. The timing system added to that reputation. Instead of relying on a long timing chain that could stretch over time, the 300 used gear-driven cam timing. The crankshaft drove the camshaft through gears, helping keep valve timing consistent across long service intervals and hard use. That kind of design did not make the engine flashy. It made it predictable. The parts were understandable, the timing was stout, and the whole package rewarded maintenance instead of punishing the owner for needing it. But simple parts alone do not explain why the 300 felt so strong in a loaded truck. To understand that, you have to look at where it made its power. Picture an old Ford pickup easing away from a feed store with the bed sagging and a trailer behind it. It does not leap forward. It does not sound like it is trying to impress anyone. The engine just settles into a low, steady pull, and the truck starts moving because the torque is already there. That was the point of the 300 Inline-Six. Its character came from displacement, a long stroke, and tuning that favored cylinder pressure at lower engine speeds. The bore and stroke were not designed to make the engine exciting near redline. They were designed to help it build useful force early, where a work truck actually needed it. In plain terms, horsepower was not the headline. Depending on the year, emissions equipment, fuel system, and rating method, the 300 often looked modest on paper. Many versions were rated somewhere around the low 100s to mid-100s in horsepower. By modern standards, that sounds underwhelming. The torque figure told the more important story. Across different years, the engine commonly landed in the low to mid-200s in pound-feet of torque. More importantly, it delivered that torque in a way that felt accessible. You did not have to wind it out to get the truck moving with tools, hay, gravel, or a small trailer behind it. That is why people compared it to a tractor. A tractor is not built to sprint. It is built to pull steadily at low speed without constant shifting or drama. The 300 had that same working personality in a road vehicle. It could lug along at low revolutions, recover from a load, and keep the driver from needing to attack every hill with the throttle pinned. That low revolution life also helped explain its survival. Engines wear every time parts change direction. Oil films are stressed, and heat builds under load. An engine that can do its job without constantly spinning hard is living an easier life, assuming it gets oil changes, cooling system care, and basic maintenance. So the 300 did not refuse to die because it made huge power. It lasted because it made the right power, in the right place, for the kind of work trucks were actually asked to do. The legend of the Ford 300 eventually grew bigger than the engine itself. People called it unkillable, bulletproof, and impossible to destroy. Those words sound good in a comment section, but they are not mechanically true. No engine is truly unkillable, including this one. Overheat it badly enough, and the cylinder head can warp, the head gasket can fail, and the oil can lose its ability to protect the bearings. Run it low on oil, and the crankshaft, camshaft, and bearings are no longer riding on the film they need to survive. Force it to live with detonation, and the shock loads can damage pistons, rings, and bearings. Overload it constantly, and heat and stress will catch up. Ignore maintenance long enough, and even a simple engine becomes a collection of worn parts waiting for the next failure. That reality matters because it makes the engine's reputation more believable, not less. The 300 did not survive because physics stopped applying. It survived because its design gave it a wider margin before abuse turned into failure. A long crankshaft, big main bearings, modest power output, low operating speeds, and a simple layout meant there was less drama inside the block during normal work. When another engine might have exposed weak cooling, thin castings, complicated controls, or a peaky power band, the Ford 6 often had enough reserve to keep going. That is where the legend came from. Farmers, contractors, fleet mechanics, and owners saw these engines tolerate missed tune-ups, heavy loads, long idle time, and rough service. Stories spread because the failures were often less common than the abuse suggested they should be. But durability alone was not enough. The 300 had to survive changing emissions rules, fuel systems, customer expectations, and a truck market that kept moving forward. So how did Ford keep such an old-school engine relevant for so long? For most of its life, the 300 was not a high-tech engine. Early versions used carburetors, simple ignition systems, and the kind of hardware a fleet mechanic could understand without a scan tool. That fit the trucks it powered, because the priority was torque, low cost, and easy service. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, that formula became harder to protect. Emissions rules kept tightening, and buyers expected trucks to start cleaner, idle smoother, and behave better in cold weather. A carburetor could be tuned to meet those demands, but it was becoming a compromise stacked on top of another compromise. Ford kept updating the engine around the edges. Fuel delivery, ignition controls, vacuum systems, and emissions equipment changed as the 300 moved through the 1980s. The basic block and work truck personality stayed familiar, but the systems around it became more complicated because the market required it. The major shift came in 1987, when electronic fuel injection arrived. Instead of relying on a carburetor to meter fuel through changing temperature, altitude, and load, the engine could use sensors and electronic control to deliver fuel more accurately. That improved cold starts, throttle response, drivability, and efficiency, without turning the engine into something fragile or exotic. That is why the fuel-injected 300 still felt like a 300. It still made its living with low-speed torque and long service life. It simply learned enough modern manners to stay legal, usable, and competitive. But adaptation only buys time. Even an engine this trusted could not outrun the future forever. By 1996, Ford finally ended production of the 300 Inline-Six. It had survived more than 3 decades, multiple emissions eras, fuel injection, and changing truck buyers. But the problem was no longer whether the engine worked. The problem was whether it still fit the business Ford was building around it. A long Inline-Six takes up space in a way newer engine layouts do not. As trucks evolved, engineers had to think about crash structure, front-end packaging, accessories, cooling systems, and shared platforms. The 300's length made those decisions harder, especially when Ford was moving toward more modern engine families that could be used across more vehicles. Emissions strategy also changed. It was not enough to make an old design pass one more test with extra controls. Automakers wanted engines designed from the beginning for tighter regulation, better diagnostics, and cleaner calibration over time. That favored newer V6 and V8 programs with more room for future updates. Buyers were changing too. Trucks were becoming daily drivers, family vehicles and image vehicles. Smoothness, horsepower, quietness, and showroom appeal mattered more than they had in the old work truck world. So the 300 did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the industry stopped rewarding the qualities that had made it famous. And that brings us back to the old truck pulling away under load. Paint faded, springs working, engine note flat and steady. Nothing about it sounds dramatic. That was the point. The Ford 300 Inline-Six was never remembered because it won races, topped horsepower charts, or made a truck feel modern. Its reputation came from mornings when there was no backup plan. A contractor needed the truck to start. A farmer needed the pump to run. A delivery van had one more route. A generator had to keep working after everyone else went home. That is why the engine refused to die in memory long after Ford stopped building it. It earned trust by being useful, simple, and hard to kill. Thanks for watching. If you have owned a Ford 300, worked one to death, or know of a high-mileage survivor still earning its keep, write its story in the comments.